Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mr. Maya's and Mr. Intellicado's United States History Midterm Review. What we're going to do, we're just going to go through a couple questions for you, about 35 or so. It doesn't have to be all in one day, but just so you guys have a good understanding of maybe what questions might sneak up on the midterm, and we'll see what you guys know, what you don't know, what we have to improve on. So let's get started. Question number one, who were the Exodusters? The Exodusters were European immigrants who settled on the Great Plains. These Exodusters settled on the Great Plains because they thought that it was going to be a great opportunity for them and a chance to actually have land as opposed to renting space. They could actually own land on the Great Plains. All right, that was the Exodusters. Next question, what is the concept of patronage? Concept of patronage is appointing a friend or colleague to a government position. Again, basically the concept is if you help me get elected, when I get elected, I will allow you to have a government position, whether it be, if I'm the mayor, you could maybe be on the city council or be one of my advisors. Either way, you're paying your friends or colleagues who may not be qualified for the position to be in a high-ranking government position. So that's the concept of patronage. The next one we're going to look at, Jim Crow laws. What were they? What did they do? Okay, what did Jim Crow laws do? Jim Crow laws separated the races in the post-war South. Basically, it's a legal way that the South wanted to segregate blacks from whites. All right, different laws for different states a lot of the times. The next one is Plessy versus Ferguson ruled what? Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that racial segregation in public accommodations was legal. Plessy versus Ferguson, if you remember the case, Homer Plessy was riding on a train. It was deemed that he should not have been riding in the train car that he should have been riding in, and it was deemed that, yes, it was legal for there to be a black-only train car, and basically it went not only from being a black-only train car, but a black-only public accommodations like restrooms and things like that, but a lot of the times the African Americans or black accommodations were not equal to those of whites. What laws kept African Americans in the South from voting? There were various laws that kept African Americans in the South from voting. Those laws were poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause. Poll taxes were taxes that African Americans had to pay when they tried to vote. However, a lot of them couldn't afford the poll taxes, so they couldn't vote. Literacy tests, a lot of them could not read the actual tests, so they weren't able to vote. And the grandfather clause, which basically allowed white men who couldn't vote, it gave them an out and a way to vote, even though they couldn't read or pay a poll tax. Next question is, the main immigration processing station in San Francisco was called what? And the answer to that question is Angel Island. The main processing station in New York City was called Ellis Island. Very good. Excellent job, everyone. In the Southwest, many Mexicans earn their living as what? Many Mexicans earn their living as farmers, okay? Especially in the early 1900s, many of them immigrated to the United States and settled in the Southwest and became farmers. Cities in the late 19th century expanded with the development of what three things? What three things allowed cities to grow very rapidly in the late 19th century? The three things that allowed them to do that were skyscrapers, elevators, and bridges. Skyscrapers were able to build up. Elevators allowed people that lived in skyscrapers to get up and down instead of using the stairs. And bridges allowed people from different parts of the city to basically more easily commute over water to different parts of the city or different cities. A good example of this would be New York City with all the boroughs. The Interstate Commerce Act gave the right to supervise railroad activities to whom? The Interstate Commerce Act gave the right to supervise the railroad activities to the federal government. Eventually, the Interstate Commerce Act was deemed unconstitutional because it was decided by the Supreme Court that only states could supervise railroad activities. The Sherman Antitrust Act, what did it do? Sherman Antitrust Act outlawed the formation of trusts that interfered with free trade. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a little bit effective, but the majority of the cases that were brought to the Supreme Court by the Sherman Antitrust Act were thrown out. Which president did the House of Representatives impeach? The president that the House of Representatives impeached was Andrew Johnson. When the Civil War began, what was Abraham Lincoln's main goal? Many people would accidentally say that Abraham Lincoln's main goal was to end slavery. That is not correct. He wanted to restore the Union. He wanted to bring the southern states, the Confederacy, back with the Union and have basically the United States back in order. What did the Supreme Court declare in the Dred Scott decision? In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court declared that being in a free territory did not make a slave free. The Dred Scott decision, a slave went across state lines with his owner and then returned to the slave state. However, it was deemed that even though the slave crossed over into the free state, they were not free because they were the property of the slave owner. In the late 1800s, collective bargaining was a technique used to do what? Collective bargaining was a technique the majority of the time in the late 1800s, even into the early 1900s. It was used to win workers' rights. Okay, workers a lot of the times in unions did not get along very well with their employers. Collective bargaining was a process by which essentially a third party would come in and mediate between the two parties and win workers' rights. Farmers who agreed to give most of their harvest to the landowners in exchange for the use of land, seeds, and tools were known as what? These farmers who agreed to give most of their harvest to the landowners in exchange for the use of land, were known as tenant farmers. A lot of people could not afford their own property, especially, early 1900s. A lot of them couldn't afford to have their own property, so they had to basically rent property and give the majority of their profit to the actual farm owners. Why is the Battle of Gettysburg considered a turning point in the Civil War? The Battle of Gettysburg is considered a turning point at the end of the Civil War because it now forces, or basically states that the South is not able to invade the North anymore. The South did not have the resources at that point to go on the offensive. The South, after the Battle of Gettysburg, their only job was to defend the southern part of the United States, which we know didn't end up working. Which of the following most allowed manufacturers to build their factories away from rivers? The question here is a little bit screwed up. Basically, what the question should state, what allowed manufacturers to build their factories away from rivers? The answer to that is electricity. Okay, the ability to move away from rivers and not rely on water power was huge for factory owners, and the fact that you can now build factories in the middle of the city and run all of your equipment on electricity saved you basically from having or limited real estate along rivers. What did social Darwinism discourage? Social Darwinism discouraged government regulation. Basically, social Darwinism is the social side of the survival of the fittest. The people in society who were rich and wealthy and smart were going to succeed more often than not than the people who were less wealthy or less intelligent. Social Darwinism. It wanted to get away from government regulation, almost a laissez-faire type situation. What is the Grange? The Grange is a group of farmers who supported local and state politicians to achieve freedom from suppression from both the railroads and the banks. During this time, railroads and their rates killed farmers because they charged so much to ship the farmers' goods. Further, the banks and the lack of regulation from banks also killed farmers. Muckrakers were whom? Muckrakers were basically crusading journalists who sought out to make known the horrors of inner city living. A great example of a muckraker, again, would be Upton Sinclair and Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis, if you remember, wrote the book basically How the Other Half Lives, and he showed all the pictures, and again, we went through them. But just know muckrakers, journalists who sought out to make known the horrors of inner city living. The primary goal of the NAACP was what? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The primary goal was equality among the races. The purpose of the formation of the NAACP was after, obviously, the Civil War, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the purpose of their formation was equality among all races. Which countries came under control of the United States after the Spanish-American War? The countries that came under control of the United States after the Spanish-American War were Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Again, we won't get into all the details here, but Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico were controlled by the United States in various ways after the Spanish-American War. One of the main reasons the United States entered World War I was because of what? The answer was outrage over German submarine warfare. German submarines were continuously sinking American ships and merchant ships and even passenger ships like the Lusitania, and eventually we were forced to go to war with the Germans. What is isolationism? What is the concept of isolationism in U.S. history? The concept of isolationism is pretty easy. It's right there in the word. Right here, isolation. All right. Theory of keeping out of other nations' affairs, keeping to yourself in order to basically stay out of wars and stay out of economic oppression that a lot of nations are facing. Who is A. Mitchell Palmer? A. Mitchell Palmer is the United States Attorney General who set up the Palmer raids in order to deport all of the communists he thought were in charge of the bombings in the United States. Although many of the findings that Palmer had were unwarranted, a lot of communists or thought to be communists and even socialists were deported from the country during the Palmer raids. Who are nativists and what did they believe? Nativists are Americans who did not like the idea of mass immigration, essentially, and extreme pride in America, and they didn't want basically foreign devils coming into the United States to interfere or bring over their communist or socialist ways of thinking. What is the Harlem Renaissance? Harlem Renaissance is the celebration of African American literature and art. The majority obviously takes place in Harlem, New York City. We talked about, the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance, and we talked about, Louis Armstrong, and different authors and artists from that era as well. Name some causes of the Great Depression. So what would be some causes of the Great Depression? Well, we'll just go through them one by one. The availability of easy credit. It was so easy for people to buy goods without actually having to pay cash. So many people accumulated a great deal of debt. Also, buying stock on margin was a huge part of this as well. Crisis in the farm sector. Many farmers after World War I faced a great deal of debt because they grew so much during World War I, and now they accumulated all this debt to grow that for the support of the war. Now they were facing a great deal of debt because the demand wasn't as high after World War I. Further tariffs on foreign goods, basically charging so high for goods coming into the United States caused a great deal of stress to be put on our economy. What was the New Deal? Again, this is pretty recent. We just went over this. The New Deal is President Roosevelt's plan to get America out of the Great Depression. A great deal of social programs were set up by President Roosevelt. Both direct and indirect relief were given to the people of America. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the FDIC, all created in order to help America get out of the Depression. At the Munich Conference, what did France and Britain do? What happened at the Munich Conference between them and Germany in order to follow the policy of appeasement? What happened at the Munich Conference was basically them giving into Hitler's demands for Sudetenland. All right? Why did the United States ultimately enter World War II? The United States ultimately enters World War II because the bombing of Pearl Harbor, okay? We did face a great deal of opposition from the Germans in the Atlantic Ocean, us trying to help out the British with the Hemispheric Defense Zone, but the bombing of Pearl Harbor ultimately got us involved in World War II by the Japanese. What is the Open Door Policy? The Open Door Policy was created by John Hay under President Teddy Roosevelt and encouraged all nations with interests in China to be able to freely trade within China within their spheres of influence. And the tiebreaker. What was the main reason that the Allied powers declared war on Adolf Hitler? What was the main reason the Allied powers declared war on Adolf Hitler? The main reason is Hitler's breaking of previously made promises and also, the straw that broke the camel's back, his invasion of Poland. We got through that pretty quick, but thank you for being patient. Hopefully we had some fun today or over the 2 days. I don't know how long this is going to take us to get through, but thanks for watching. See you guys later.